All right, here we go. Sorry, just trying to get myself together here for 1 second. All right, looks like it's 6 o'clock. We still have a few people trickling in, but we'll just go ahead and get started, and they can catch up on the recording. Probably won't miss much in the first few minutes. But for those of you that have kind of attended one of these webinars in the past, welcome back. For those of you that are new to it, this is I think webinar number 6 for me this year, and right now it's scheduled to be the last one, unless there's demand for more sailing type webinars. So I'll probably add maybe one more per month for the next few months if there's interest. So my name is Jenna Ferrieri. I'm one of the sailing specialists with Navionics, and I'm here tonight to just kind of put out as much knowledge as I can, and hopefully you guys walk away with something useful. So just bear with me tonight. I do feel a little bit under the weather, so if I'm a little bit out of it or if I say something dumb, feel free to call me out. There's, I think on the top of your screens, there's going to be a Q&A and a chat and a raise hand. Probably the Q&A and the chat are going to be the most helpful. Those actually pop something up on my screen so I can notice it. And if I don't see it during the presentation, I'll try to get to it at the end. And anything that I think requires a better explanation, I'll probably defer to email. So if you think you have like a really specific question, specific to like your boat or your conditions, feel free and shoot me an email. The last slide will have my email address on that. So let's jump into it. Tonight we're going to be doing gauging wind shifts effectively. So kind of jump into our intro here. So what is wind? It's essentially flow of air due to pressure differentials. So air usually goes from high pressure to low pressure, and that's going to create that airflow, that wind. And globally, the wind patterns are driven by temperature differences between the equator and the poles, and then your Coriolis effect. So that's going to make our kind of our weather systems, our high pressures, our low pressure systems, kind of the when they show you the weather map on the news, those are going to be the systems that are going to be from our global wind patterns. Locally, though, when you look up the wind for the day, it's going to tell you the wind's out of the west at 10 knots, but there's going to be some slight variation in that, and that's what we're going to be terming the shifts out on the water. So we're not going to be looking so much at the global things as much as we are going to look at kind of here's the given conditions for the day, how is it going to change kind of just slightly for my area specifically. So hopefully, kind of inevitably, if you've been on a boat or even on land, if you paid attention to it, you're going to have been affected by wind shifts at some point. And when you're out on the water, it's going to be especially important to pay attention to these when you're racing, but also pretty good thing to keep an eye on when you're cruising or just out for the day, those sorts of things. So the goal of the webinar tonight is to kind of give you a foundation to be able to kind of predict or foresee the wind shifts coming, mostly topography based, but you can also kind of gauge off of the other boats sailing around, those sorts of things, understanding the type of shift and then being able to react to it in order to keep your boat moving. So little disclaimer, there's a lot that I could go into in terms of tactics and sail trim, and I kind of wanted to just focus it kind of on the base foundation type information. So any big questions on tactics or sail trim, definitely defer to email. It'll be easier for me to kind of put together a good response that way rather than just a 2-second, here's your answer. Okay, so let's jump into outline. So we're going to start with intro to wind shear and gradient. So these are kind of the oddball ones that you never really hear talked about too much, but they are out there and they're important. Then we'll jump down to local topography and its effects and kind of what to look out for, what to expect in different conditions there. How to judge persistent and oscillating shifts. Then we'll go into lifts and headers, and then we'll look at velocity shifts versus a wind shift. So wind shear and gradient, we'll start with some definitions. So wind shear is going to be the change in wind direction as you get higher, so change in altitude, change in height, whether the wind stays consistent in one angle or whether, as you go higher, it kind of twists around somewhere. Wind gradient, on the other hand, is going to be the change in speed as you change height. So kind of tried to get a picture of both. The wind shear, just grabbed off Occam's site, and wind gradient kind of just made a little simple diagram here. So both of these conditions exist because of the Earth's boundary layer. So surface friction is going to be kind of more or less the biggest driving force there. So think of dragging something across, a pretty rough surface. So think of just kind of a continent in general, there's going to be terrain, there's going to be buildings, there's going to be trees, things in the way that are going to increase the friction of the airflow over the land. So you're going to get kind of this dragging effect, and the lower portion is going to have kind of chaotic, slower speeds, chaotic directions, and as you get higher, away from kind of that chaos, for lack of a better term, you're going to get more uniform flow. So unfortunately for us, when we're sailing, our mass only goes so high, so it's more than likely we're going to be kind of in that turbulent, chaotic region, that height there. So shear and gradient are definitely going to affect us, and they're always going to be present. But some days, when the wind's higher, a little more consistent, it might not be as noticeable as other days where it's kind of lighter and really shifty. So the easiest way to tell that you're kind of being influenced by a shear or gradient is to look at your instruments, or look at everything aloft compared to what you're feeling down on the surface of the water. So, you may have a Windex up top, or just your telltales up top, but really you just need to take in the visual of everything that's going on and compare it to what you're feeling, what your crew's feeling. If you have instruments down on deck, what they're showing, that sort of thing. Caveat is that wind gradient over the height of your sail or of your mast is probably not going to be as apparent as wind shear. I don't think a lot of boats out there have the sort of instruments with the resolution to see those changes of, at 4 feet off the boom, it's 4.2 knots, and at 6 feet off the boom, it's 4.5 knots. I don't know that you'll have instruments that will be able to capture that. So it's generally over 5 knots where the wind's consistent. You're not really going to be trying to trim for wind gradient. Wind shear is going to be your big focus. So the changing in direction rather than the changing in speed. So let's focus a little bit on the wind shear in the last bullet. So when you're in wind shear, the biggest telltale is that the top of the sail on one tack is going to appear to be lifted. So your leeward telltales aren't going to be flying. It's going to seem like you need to come up. And then on the other tack, it's going to seem like you're headed. So you might get some luffing up top, but the foot of the sail is going to be trimmed nicely. So how do we deal with that? Well, we're going to want to make use of our sail twist. And more than likely, we're going to have to trim for each tack individually. So a lot of boats that I've sailed on kind of have the metric of, you want to be 2 or 3 inches off the top spreader for the leach of the jib. You want your boom center line, those sorts of things, or trim in your vang until you hit this mark that we put on the lines that come off the vang. So that makes it easy for crew. But you really want to get to that point and then start to fine tune from there to make use of kind of your given conditions for that day. So on the lifted tack, so if we appear to be lifted, our leeward telltales aren't going to fly. So we want to trim the top of the sail to those telltales that aren't flying. So we want to open up the top of the sail. And we can do that by easing off the vang on the main sail. If it's the jib, we can bring the cars back, take a little bit of that downward force off. And we'll want to take in on the Cunningham a little bit and just get that twist, or open up the sail, remove that twist a little bit. On the tack where the boat appears to be headed, or where the sail appears to be headed on top, we're going to want to close it off, trim in the top of the sail, but leave the foot. So how are we going to do that? We're going to take on the vang, tighten up the leach, bring that curl in. On the jib, we bring the cars forward, and we'll bump off the Cunningham just a little bit to give a little more curl. Okay, so that's enough for that. We'll move into local topography now. So this is something you're probably all pretty familiar with. Sorry. But I was reading an article, and it had that image there at the bottom, and I thought it was pretty cool, so I wanted to include it, more than anything, to include that picture. But when we're out on the water, the surrounding topography, whether it's terrain or man-made structures or trees or things like that, is going to have a big influence on the local wind. So whether that be a shadow, a hole, wind hole, any funneling or puffs or shifts, things like that. So we really want to be looking for that local variation when we're sailing inshore or in bays. As you move farther and farther offshore, it's going to have less of an effect. So this is really for the inshore stuff. And so what's the reason for it? Well, the wind can't go through a landmass or through a building, so it must either go over it or around it. Kind of makes sense. So what happens then when it goes over or around is that there's going to be a shadow or a hole in the area just to the lee of the structure, and then around the boundaries of that there's going to be some change in either wind speed and or direction. So kind of make reference to this picture on the bottom here. So if the wind goes over a structure, so in this case kind of a mock building or a hill, it's going to kind of take that arc pattern, and you can see there's kind of the downward and an eddying effect here in front of this building. Just ignore that there's buildings downwind of it. But the wind at some point is going to come down and it's going to hit the water, and then it may even bounce along. So when it hits the water, it's more than likely going to be in the form of a puff, just because it's going to be accelerating through that arc. And so it's going to kind of accelerate through, hit the water, that'll be your puff. There's going to be that hole just in the lee of the building or the hill, and then if it bounces, you're going to see lulls and puffs kind of alternating down to some distance downwind until it either peters out or hits some equilibrium. If it goes around the building, you're going to see shifts in direction. So you can kind of see in this picture on the right, there's like some swirling effects. So in addition to the vertical mixing, there's going to be some lateral mixing. So you may see a bend, or this is more common around like headlands and things where the wind kind of bends around and follows them. You know, you really want to be aware of when you're sailing in that area, that local shift around that headland. Wind funneling is probably something that you've been exposed to if you've walked through a city or something like that, or some area with very tall buildings. But think of it as a hose. So you have all these air particles that are normally in kind of uniform distribution coming across land, and then they get funneled in between the buildings because there's nowhere else to go. They can't go through the buildings, so the one route is through. So think of it like a hose. If you put your thumb over half of the nozzle, you're going to be increasing the speed at which the water comes out, increasing the pressure differential there. So the wind kind of does the same thing. When it funnels in, it's going to accelerate the flow through those buildings, and you'll get that funneling effect. And you know, if you're sailing along kind of across or down this picture here, you can see you kind of go from kind of sustained winds to a lull to what you could see as a puff, but is really kind of more sustained higher speed in that area. But as you're sailing across it, it's going to be, you know, normal wind, lull, puff, lull, and then puff on, and then probably back to normal wind right after that. So just things to be aware of, you know, if you're sailing across some sort of like an urban area. So segueing from that local topography and the shifts there into judging what sort of shifts those are. So while you're sailing, and especially if you're racing, I don't think I can emphasize that enough, you should be recording what the wind directions are around the course and throughout the day. So around the course, more than likely is going to be start line and windward mark for you. If you're cruising around, you know, if it's an area you're familiar with, the more you sail, the more you'll kind of pick up on, you know, oh, I sailed around this corner here and the wind kind of shifted left. That seems to be pretty general. I've done this sailing for the last 4 weeks and it's done the same thing every single time. So as you sail more in an area, you'll kind of pick up on the local shifts, topography shifts. If you're racing in a new area, maybe your first practice day, as you sail around, maybe try to stay in tune to what sort of the local shifts are taking place. But when you're racing, you really want to keep track of wind at the starting line, wind upwind on the course, and then if you have a leeward mark that's down past the starting line, obviously grab that too. And that's going to give you insight as to whether the shifts are oscillating or persistent. So an oscillating shift is going to go just back and forth, kind of around the median or average wind direction, while a persistent shift is going to have a trend of moving in one direction, whether that be left or right. So the easiest way to track this is going to be a wind table. So I usually record the time, kind of my general location, whether it's start line, windward mark, leeward mark, and then the wind direction. So from the table, you should be able to interpret it if it's oscillating just by looking at the wind directions. And it's a way to help keep track of kind of what that average wind direction should be. And we'll let you tell whether you're lifted or headed. So kind of two examples here, the oscillating shift and the persistent shift. So the table on the left, you can see we recorded the times, everything's around the start line in this example, and we can see wind direction in degrees is going to be 265, goes to 268, back down to 264, down a little more to 262, and then it goes back up to 266. So you can kind of see there's not really a trend in those readings, so it's just kind of oscillating back and forth, but it's not really tending toward one of the directions. So that's going to be your oscillating shift. The persistent shift, on the other hand, table on the right, we can see it the numbers do kind of oscillate slightly. So 265, 268, down to 267, up to 270, but it's tending to move to the right. So the numbers are getting higher, but it's still kind of oscillating around a little bit slightly, but moving in that direction. So just two examples there. Obviously, you can adapt your table to what you like. You don't have to follow this sort of format at all. But this is the sort of thing that you should be going for, especially if you're out racing. Okay, we'll jump into lifts and headers. So more than likely, if you've been out racing, you've probably heard people say, oh, we're lifted, oh, we're headed, those sorts of things. So what are they, and what to do when you get in one? So the lift is going to be as you're sailing along, and the wind's going to shift towards the stern. So upwind, this is going to allow you to point higher at the mark. So that's a good thing. You're going to make gains upwind. Downwind, on the other hand, if the wind shifts towards the stern, you can tell if you were going broad reach, the wind shifts towards the stern, you're going to be going dead downwind. So you can get that accidental crash jibe, or it's going to force you to point the boat higher to maintain that broad reach, and you'll end up sailing away from the mark. So that's bad. The header, on the other hand, the wind's going to shift toward the bow. So upwind, it's going to force you to head down or bear away from the mark that you were traveling towards. So obviously not a good thing. But downwind, it's going to be the opposite of that. It's actually going to let you sail deeper. So, you know, you're sailing broad reach, you get the header, the wind moves forward a little bit. You can actually head down now a little bit more, and maybe, ideally, even head straight for your mark if you're on like a symmetric spinnaker. So upwind, your lift is going to be good, and downwind, your header is going to be good. So it usually helps when we're out racing, having a few crew. It's a good job if you have someone new on board too, kind of explain what's going on, the phenomenon, and then have that person sit on the rail and call boats that are lifted and boats that are headed, just to give you kind of that extra information of what's going on as the helmsperson or the tactician on the boat. Oh, and then the last bullet there is if you are experiencing a header or lift on one tack, if you go over to the other one, you're going to experience that other condition. So if you're sailing port tack and you're headed, if you tack over, you're going to be lifted on starboard tack. So I have a few diagrams to help explain that a little bit better. So we've got the original wind is the red arrow here, and those red dashed lines are going to be our original close-hauled courses. And then we'll complicate it a little bit. So the red was the original wind, the old wind, and the purple is now the new wind. So we were sailing port tack here on this close-hauled course, and then with the new wind shifted forward toward the bow, so we got headed. We had to bear away in order to maintain that close-hauled course. But if we tacked over onto starboard tack, you could see that we're now actually pointed higher toward the mark, if, say, the mark was this marina up at the top here. So we're actually making more upwind gains toward that marina on the lifted tack. So lifted tack is good upwind, downwind, the header is good. Okay, so some tips for sailing in lifts and headers. So when you're lifted, you know, you're above your kind of median direction for the condition. So you can sail slightly lower, you're still lifted, slightly lower, but actually sail faster and maximize your VMG toward your upwind mark. So not only does it help you maximize the VMG, but you'll actually get to the next shift a little bit sooner since you're moving faster. Yeah, so being lifted allows you to sail farther upwind in the direction of the median wind. But if you're sailing in headers, you're not making those same gains upwind. So what do you do if you find yourself in the header? I'm sure you've all heard that adage, don't sail in the headers, tack out of them, and then you'll be lifted. And for the most part, that's true. It just comes down to the timing factor. So at what point do you tack? You know, do you just go right away, knee-jerk reaction, throw the boat over, tack over? Or do you kind of plan it out a little bit? And so my approach to it is that chances are, if you're sailing and you're lifted, and then you get headed, when you realize it, you're still actually going to be lifted above what your median close haul angle is for your average wind. So don't tack right away because you're still lifted. So if you tack right away, you will be headed slightly and it'll make you'll think that lift is more, but you're actually starting off headed and then getting lifted back up. So sailing lifted, you realize you're being headed, don't tack yet because you are still lifted. So now if you've been tracking your wind conditions throughout the day and your close hauled angles, what you normally sail at for the median, you should be able to track your heading now as you become headed and judge the moment at which you become your normal close hauled course for that median wind direction, right? So you were lifted, you get headed, you come down, you come down, come down. This is your average course. Okay, now I'm not going to be lifted anymore, so I'm not making any gains. I'm average. If I keep getting headed, I'm going to lose ground. So that's the point at which you tack. Then when you come over, you'll be lifted again on the other course. If you sail past that point, you're going to get headed more, and you're missing the opportunity to be lifted. And I don't have a picture of it in here, but there's that ladder rung theory where, if you have two boats, do this way, two boats here on the same rung. If you get lifted, this boat actually ends up, this finger ends up with better upwind gains than the other one. So poor hand signaling there, but hopefully you've heard the ladder rung theory before, and that kind of makes sense. All right, and then velocity shifts versus wind shifts. So I think this is probably my last slide. So pretty quick tonight, and I apologize for that, but trying to move quickly and then trying to get over this cold or whatever is coming down on me over here. So let's jump into it. So velocity shifts. One thing to be mindful of is the velocity shift, and it's often going to come down on you in the form of thinking that you're being headed, but instead the wind speed's dropping and your apparent wind angle just goes forward. So let me explain that a little bit. So when the true wind speed changes, your apparent wind angle is going to change. So true wind speed increases, the apparent wind angle is going to go aft, and it's going to give you a velocity lift. So think of when you're sailing close hauled and you hit a puff and you kind of feel like the boat kind of rounds up a little bit and you can take it a little bit higher, kind of eke out that little extra bit of upwind in that puff. So that's what's happening. Apparent wind angle goes aft, allows the boat to be lifted. So the true wind speed decreases, your apparent wind angle is going to go forward, and it's going to give you the feeling of a velocity header. So the boat's going to carry the momentum, carry that extra speed into the lower wind speed. So, if you're riding your bike really fast and then, that's not a good way to explain it. Anyway, so you're going to carry your momentum in, lower wind speed, so it's going to feel like there's more wind in front of you. The boat's going to flatten out, and your sail's going to stall. It may even backwind a little bit. So that's what's going on there, is a velocity header. So a lot of times people will react to the velocity header as a normal header, bear the boat away, try to get the sails full, and then pick it back up from there. But there are some differing opinions on what to actually do in these lulls or these velocity headers. So it's, do you bear away and keep the telltales flying, or do you take that header and try to maintain your course? So logic is going to tell you to bear away, keep the telltales flying. That's what we're all taught to do, is make sure your telltales are flying. That's going to be the best laminar flow over the sails. But most of the time, if you do that, when you take that bear away, you're going to lose VMG and you're giving up gaps to leeward, and you're not making that upwind progress anymore. So what I usually like to do is, if we do get that feeling of the header, I'll take a look at the true wind speed instrument. If it is dropping, the wind speed's dropping, then I know it's a velocity header. So I'm going to hold out for a little bit. I'm going to fight that instinct to bear away and instead let the boat decelerate and kind of settle out to the new conditions. Once we're kind of settled out, then I'll adjust the heading slightly if the wind shifted, wind had a little bit of a header in it, but not the full header that I would have taken if I bared away to get the telltales to fly. So when you fight that instinct, let the boat decelerate. You might want to bump your sails open just a little bit to keep them from hooking around and backwinding a little bit. And so that's kind of my process is, you hit the point, you're being headed. Is it a velocity header? Is it a real header? Look at your wind instruments for that. If the wind speed's decreasing, it's definitely going to be your velocity header. So try to fight that instinct to bear away, let the boat decelerate, kind of get back into the equilibrium, the rhythm of things in the groove, and then adjust your heading slightly if you need to. So that's really, in my opinion, you guys may disagree, but in my opinion, that's going to prevent your oversteering. So a lot of times when you hit the header, it's knee-jerk reaction to bear away. You know, you kind of oversteer a little bit, keep those telltales flying, and then you'll kind of head back off, and you're kind of doing this S-curve. But if you kind of fight it, let the boat decelerate, do some minor steering, overall, you'll keep the boat in the groove for a little bit longer. So that's kind of my opinion there. Hopefully that process makes sense, and if anybody disagrees, feel free to tell me. But yeah, so that's all I've got for you tonight, guys. This was a quick one, seems like. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to shoot them at me. My email is at the bottom there. Again, if you have like a specific question, boat specific, location specific, condition specific, go ahead and just shoot me an email. It'll be much easier for me to answer in more detail that way. But if anybody has any quick questions, want me to go back to any images, re-explain anything, go ahead and give me a shout. And otherwise, I'll let you guys scoot out of here a little bit early and enjoy your evening. And keep eyes on the Navionics website. The recording will be posted either tomorrow or next week if you want to rewatch, and then keep your eyes out for any more of my webinars. Okay. Thank you. All right. So if there's no questions, I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. And then if you have any questions, again, just feel free to email me. There'll be a follow-up email tomorrow that should have my email address in it if you didn't copy it down right now. All right. Thank you, guys. Have a good night.